Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Politically Depressed. As always, I'm your host, Ayman McAdam. So, welcome, everybody, to the very first episode of Season 2. I don't know exactly what that means, practically, for a sort of weekly podcast, but I have had a bit of a rethink, or rather, so it's been a few weeks since I posted the last episode, and it has been at least a few months since I've been feeling the same motivation to do this podcast. And I realized a part of it is because I try to do everything kind of all the time. And instead, as in basically sometimes I was trying to make arguments and like analysis and finding myself completely flustered because, it's something that I do. I do talk about a lot of very deep things. But sometimes I find myself sort of deep into a conversation or an episode, and I realize, wow, this is going nowhere, or this is very hard to follow, or I'm not making a very concrete point, because this podcast was never meant to be a space for, capital A analysis. It's always there, but it is a blog style podcast, wherein, I talk about what's been on my mind that week, or something specific that I've been thinking about or working through. And yeah, I'm just going to kind of readjust. I'm going to do more video stuff for those of you watching video-wise, only because, I think it's better for engagement, and not in a metrics sense of the term, but I don't know. I feel like people are more able to connect if there's an actual face talking about it, about the stuff. And especially some of the sort of darker stuff or harder to process. I definitely feel like having a face, at least optional. I'll still release these episodes on Spotify and the like. Kind of lends itself to, just forming a bit more of a connection or feeling a bit more held. I also feel like I can probably communicate a little bit more with my face. I might add some animations or pictures, but definitely nothing that's like too substantial that like people only listening would miss out on. But so yeah, basically I'm going to try to have a rethink, or I have had a rethink about the podcast. And I am gonna start a kind of new format, or rather the format that I think most people towards the end I'd been playing around with. I think now I'm going to try and regularize. That is basically have a sort of intro, do my little advert of something specific, of the Patreon, of another podcast or another project I'm working on. We'll get to that one in a bit. And then talk some like headlines, but also that's not obligatory, but it's mostly just a space to decompress. I don't know. Kind of just want to make this a little less hard on me. Only because, especially now, I finished the video essay. I realized that how I went about things was not sustainable at all. It consumed way too much of my time and way too much of my thinking. I hope it's going to be worth it for those that watch it. Hopefully I'll have it out by this week on YouTube. By the end of this week or next. It's already on Patreon for anyone who wants to watch it. But so, yeah. Basically, that's just my small introduction to the kind of new thinking I have about the show. Oh, if you're noticing that I look like I'm in a weird situation or in a weird place, for those who can see me, I'm in Belgium again. And yeah, so that's why this is not my background. And it might sound a bit different for those listening, for everybody, but hopefully not too different. So yeah, so what I'm going to do today is talk about something that I've been thinking a lot about. And I know there's a lot of shit going on. And now with Trump, it's been like 13 days or something. And planes are already falling out of the sky. The budget cuts and the incredibly, like, unbelievable shifts, just immediate. It's very hard to take in. And a part of it is obviously part of it. It's kind of shock doctrine. And I know a lot of people are very quickly feeling very hopeless because they're kind of attacking everybody on all fronts. It's like full-on class war, unhinged. Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, is kind of running the US government. Especially how much privilege, how much like power he's been given, like access. Anyway, but I'm not going to talk about that. Because again, that's exactly the kind of thing that I'd find myself talking about for 10 minutes and realize this is not that good. I don't have that much to say except holy fuck. So there are other people talking about that. I might talk a bit about it. But the main thing I'm going to talk a bit about today is something I've been dealing with my analyst, which is something I've noticed I know a lot of people do, and it's very unchecked. And that is treating the political as personal. Or maybe it's more like misidentifying the personal in the political. I don't know how to... You'll see where I'm going when I talk about it more, but there is a very common phrase that I've definitely talked a lot about, and it's like a big part of this podcast, wherein the personal is political. I'm kind of flipping it a bit. Yeah, as in, I'm not like redoing that phrase. I'm just saying this isn't talked about as much, and it's interesting. Like, it's not a slogan, the political is personal, because oftentimes, no, it is not. But I think a lot of the times it is. And if nothing else, I think acknowledging that sometimes our engagement in politics, in society, well, obviously in society, but our understandings of politics, our view, our actions, our ways of being politically often have a lot of personal baggage with it. And if nothing else, checking that baggage is very useful, because I think there's a lot of problems that come down the line that could be avoided. But yes, I'm going to talk about when the political is personal. Before I get into that, here's the announcement. I have a new podcast. I don't know if people know about this, but I have a podcast that I'm doing with a very dear friend and very dear comrade, S2-E1, on mutual aid. The podcast is called The Mutual Aid Podcast, because anarchists are very good at titling things. And it's available on Spotify, on Apple Podcast, on YouTube, on a couple of others. And we just talk about mutual aid. We are interviewing very fascinating, very cool, very inspirational people. And the focus is, how do we organize in these times of crisis? How do we build power outside of the sort of traditional party system? How can we actually, do something in the face of these collapses, in the face of the ascension of the far right and the kind of nothingness that is the electoral left, or God forbid, liberals. So yeah, check that podcast out. We've got 5 episodes out already. The first 2 or 3, it's me and S2-E1 talking about mutual aid, our understandings of it. And we've had 2 interviews so far, both of them honestly very, very fucking interesting. And I recommend it. So check it out. So, okay. I'm going to try and do some headlines, but maybe I should have prepared a bit more for that. But basically, yeah, Trump, Elon Musk. I'm actually writing an essay at the moment, or I just finished the first draft about Musk and 4chan, because I really realized that not many people know what 4chan is, or like all these internet subcultures. But a lot of the bullshit that Musk did as soon as, Trump was elected or inaugurated, straight out of 4chan. But it's like stale 4chan, which I don't know if it's better or worse, but whatever. He's a billionaire. He's like, in the White House. But yeah, some of the jokes he made. I don't know if people know he renamed his Twitter account Kecius Maximus. And it's like, it's so cringe. But it's not just cringe. Again, it's cringe, but it's like real. It's like fascism. But it's also just like the stupidest, most like cringy dad trying to like fellow kids his way into 4chan. But yeah, there's definitely a lot there. What else is going on? I mean, I definitely have a lot to talk about Lebanon, with the ceasefire. Something happened a few days ago when the ceasefire was meant to end in Lebanon, or rather, so basically part of the ceasefire agreement was that the Israeli army, who was occupying certain areas in the south, would withdraw within 60 days. And so that 60-day timeline finished, but the Israelis didn't withdraw. Netanyahu himself said that they would not withdraw and they were going to stay a bit longer. The people from these villages, from these towns, from these areas were like, no, we're going to go back home. And so they coordinated amongst themselves. They got in convoys and they drove back to their towns. You know, I think there's a list of like 12 or 13 of them. Some of them went with the Lebanese army, some of them just went alone and confronted this colonial army who was occupying their territory. And in some cases managed to essentially kick out the Israelis, who then withdrew. In other cases, the Israelis continued with their aggression and their occupational violence and killed about 30 people and wounded dozens of others. These are people who are returning back home. That's the only thing they did. And they were killed by an occupational army, by a genocidal army. Anyway, I think the act of returning, and this was, I think, the exact same day that people in Gaza were returning to the north. And so these scenes of people returning to their homes is so powerful. But the act of it, the sort of insistence, to me, this was one of the greatest sort of acts of anti-colonialism in history. You know what I mean? It's one of these things that it's kind of every day, just mixed in with the rest of it. But like seeing it for what it is, it's unbelievable. It's very difficult to describe. You know what I mean? Like you would imagine reading this in a history book and like, oh, the people just got up and went home, you know, and drove and faced the armies. And some of this footage, like you have someone literally filming and a tank like approaches right up towards him and he just films into the barrel of the tank and then flips them off. You know, and these are people from the south of Lebanon and these are the Israelis and whatever. But it's colonialism, you know, and this is an act of anti-colonialism. And yeah, it's just incredible. But the fight continues because the Israelis withdrew only from a few of the towns, but there's still some towns and areas that they have not. But again, what people are finding when the Israelis withdraw is just utter destruction. It's just the same logic of like burnt, like scorched earth, like destroying all the houses, destroying all the streets, destroying all the farms. It's fucked. And also, I mean, another headline, I guess, is that the assault on Jenin has gone on, I think, now 2 weeks. Specifically, the Israeli assault, because the Palestinian Authority had already started an assault, like open warfare, against militants in Jenin, like a week prior, or like a month prior. But now the Israelis have escalated it, and there was footage yesterday of this, like, bombing of numerous houses in Jenin, and it was just fucked up. They are basically going to use the Gaza playbook, as they did in Lebanon, now in the West Bank. And, of course, Gaza and the West Bank are not two completely separate entities. These are occupied Palestinian territories. These are Palestinians. And the goal of kicking out the Palestinians, of taking over the rest of historic Palestine, is the same project, you know? This is why it's problematic when people separate the two. This is why Israelis and like Zionists literally separate the two, but also like kind of separate them a bit so people forget that this is Palestine. Anyway, so that's happening. Okay, I guess those are the headlines. There are many more, but those are the ones that definitely I've been sitting with the last couple of days. Oh, here's the last one. Because this is really fucked. Trump has been making threats to, to allow the Israelis to kick out Palestinians, to kick out 2 million Palestinians from Gaza and from the West Bank. And he's made sort of these public comments that Egypt and Jordan should take in these Palestinian refugees, or what would be made. Some of them are already refugees, but like as in the expelled Palestinians. And so Jordan and Egypt, their foreign ministers come out and they're like, no, we have too much respect for the Palestinians. This is an injustice against the Palestinians. Sisi organized a protest at the Rafah crossing, where like hundreds or like dozens of his supporters went to protest. Like, no, we will not take in Palestinians. But you know what I mean? It's posed not as we will not take in Palestinians, but more so we are against the expulsion of Palestinians. And I cannot express my contempt for the Jordanians, for the Egyptians, specifically these regimes, their foreign ministers. Imagine that Sisi orchestrated essentially a protest at the Rafah border against this, but not a single time did he do anything similar against the siege of Gaza, because he was participating in it. The siege of Gaza, up until the Israelis took over the crossing, was a joint siege by the Israelis and the Egyptians. So this hypocrisy, I mean, the entire history, at least Egypt since the 70s, but Jordan, literally the conception of the state, is side by side with Zionism. There is no Jordan without Israel. And a lot of people don't know this, but the Hashemite monarchy, the one that is still in power, had these like covert agreements with the Zionists dating back to the 30s. In 1948, they did not engage seriously in fighting back the Zionists, during the Nakba. Instead, all the Jordanians did is they took over a certain amount of territory. They took the West Bank. Jordan occupied the West Bank from 1948 to 1967, when the Israelis took it over. So it is absolutely ludicrous hypocrisy. And they're shitting themselves because this would fuck up basically the arrangement that they've had with the Zionists. All on the back of the Palestinians. But now the Israelis aren't playing ball with the arrangements that they've made. So that's been absolutely bonkers, but I'm honestly so furious at these Arab regimes, because now it's exposing, a lot of the stuff's coming to surface. Like the Egyptians released a statement where they talked about the principles of the Palestinian struggle. Like, and I wrote a thing, like, I don't remember, sieging Gaza, besieging 2 million Palestinians. I don't think that was part of the principles of the Palestinian struggle. So I have so much contempt for Sisi, for King Abdullah. I know very well that they have absolutely no solidarity with Palestinians, and they've done nothing over the last year and a half. And the only reason that they care at all to be responding to Trump in this way, partly because it just plays well with their audience, with their demographics, to seem like they're standing up to the big bully and to like claim that they're with the Palestinians, is because it would fuck up their rule intensely. Like it would be a disaster for the Egyptian and Jordanian regime. And fuck it. Like, it's this really weird thing where, like, good. I mean, like, 100% no, I'm not saying good, the expulsion of millions of Palestinians into Jordan and Egypt. But the reason they're afraid of this is not because that is an injustice, and that is ethnic cleansing, and that is genocide. their reason is because we need to maintain the system in which we have our own and you have your own. And like, I think the only way we could actually do any serious opposition to Israel, is aside from like outside of these regimes, which have captured so much of the political space. That's basically the premise of my video essay, or at least one of the premises. And so, yeah, anyway, to get to the sort of like main topic, the thing that I think I have a lot more to talk about, and, it kind of returns a bit to the roots of this podcast, because politically depressed, I always envisioned it, as a cute title to basically be a blog of me just like talking about whatever. Well, not whatever, but still. But also, talking about mental health, quote unquote mental health, in these moments of crisis or in these times of crisis and collapse. Repoliticizing discussions of and notions and understandings of what is just relegated to like a medical thing. Everyone I know is either depressed, anxious, ADHD, or rather are exhibiting and experiencing things like ADHD. And a part of it is, how much stimuli there is, how much information we're all subjected to, not just through phones and internet and social media, but just things happening, capitalism, people's sort of necessity to earn a living and work tirelessly, whatever. And yeah, I don't know, essentially doing the work that used to be done by villages. I mean, all these couples that I know that have children, and it's like the amount of work, and then the cooking, and then the taking care of yourself, and then the sort of like recreation. Like, no one has time for anything, let alone to think about themselves. Anyway, depression, obvious reasons, anxiety, obvious reasons. But so, as some of you may know, I have been seeing this psychoanalyst for a few months now. She's Lebanese. She's great. I really like her. We've definitely got like a decent chemistry. And I like the whole process. It's my first time with an analyst. I've been with therapists before, but I've always been interested in analysis and kind of do it myself, I've been doing analysis to myself like since I was 18, since I discovered it, like free association, exploring the patterns, trying to trace back certain behaviors to my childhood or seeing where it began. And one thing I definitely hit on is that, I definitely noticed that a lot of the times we talk about politics, we're actually talking about personal stuff. And that is something that's very rooted in psychoanalysis. Freud even said that things like social justice and activism and whatever are all sort of diversions of the original libidinal urge. I don't think that's necessarily how every, psychoanalyst thinks of things. It's definitely like a Freud thing. It's very reductionistic. Because I definitely do believe, obviously, that a lot of people are engaged socially and politically, not out of a kind of, oh, I actually want to fuck, but, or, you know what I mean? Or I want to be correct, I want to feel potent. It's definitely not always the case. I would argue that it's mostly not the case. I definitely think it is sometimes the case. I find myself sometimes, when doing some analysis, not just of myself, but also of certain discourses. And it's not just like we're to blame, like certain political actors play on this a lot. I basically think part of Kamala Harris's campaign was, playing like the mean mommy, the one who's gonna like take care of it, I'm gonna get rid of the bad man. The whole thing of like hush, I don't know, so that's like, there's a kind of strong woman, but also someone who's going to like take care of things, in a kind of maternalistic whatever. But also her use of memes, and And I remember this one thing, someone told me about it and I watched it, like her saying the word bitch. And it just really reminded me of like sometimes when we had like a teacher who would swear. I remember my first teacher when I was like in, I don't know, when I was like 14, 15, he said shit or something and we're like, oh, and this guy was so cool, you know what I mean? Like, oh, he said the word shit. And yeah, she's like that cool auntie who like dances with Beyonce and sings and you know, isn't afraid to let loose a little bit, like and it didn't work because it's super fucking disingenuous and obviously that's not who she is and how everything works, but that's definitely the presentation. Um you know, I think a lot of like Arab regimes, a lot of Arab leaders really play the kind of daddy role. Um, I think basically Abdel Nasser, the original Arab leader, the original Arab daddy. I seriously, and there is a lot of kind of sexualization of these figures, even to this day. And this is definitely not talked about a lot, and this is a bit funny to say because they haven't even buried him, and it's a bit. But a lot of people had this with Nasrallah. Nasrallah, definitely people had a very, very fucking strong daddy complex towards. With a kind of sexualization of the way he'd stroke his beard and his kind of smile, but also that he was the adult in the room. And you know, it's funny, I'm not going to just talk about other people. I felt like that. I felt like that for years. And now daddy's dead. Like, you know what I mean? It's so fucked up. But we do definitely live in a world wherein our politicians, it's very condescending. They treat us like children and they treat themselves like adults. But what we've found is that they're not adults. They have no idea what the fuck's going on. Sometimes they don't know what they're doing, but they definitely do not know how to respond to the crises of the modern day, of climate change, of like sustainable economics, of runaway capitalism, of nukes. These are definitely not adults. We're definitely not children, but basically those who are in charge, who are ruling, they are not adults. But there's definitely this posturing or this positioning of daddy will take care of things. I am the kind of like, it's like tough love. You don't know, but this is actually good for you. So there's that. But there is also sometimes, I've noticed, my hesitation to write certain things does sometimes stem not from the fact that I think I'm wrong, or I think it's not the right thing to say, or the right moment, but more so it feels like I'm afraid of being cancelled. And what is being cancelled? It's being kind of treated as lesser, kicked out, made to feel silly or stupid or irrelevant. That last one is actually really important for me as someone who is like newly in the diaspora, who comes from a country who was very condescending about the diaspora. And so my feeling sometimes is that I'm afraid of being irrelevant, of being, you know, not one of the cool kids. And I think that's something a lot of people experience. I mean, there is a lot of like group dynamics when we're talking about especially organizing, but also in terms of presenting ourselves. One thing I'm going to try not to do anymore in this podcast is edit myself too much. Because I noticed the last few episodes, I would really judge myself and be afraid of what people will say about what I'm going to say. And so I just kind of delete. And sometimes I'll do that because, yeah, sometimes I just ramble. But other than that, no, I need to be a bit more brave, but also care for the opinions of those who will hold me when they share those opinions, you know? Anybody who's going to kind of cast me aside for having said a thing, fuck them. I'm not going to be trying to market myself or like orient my thoughts towards people who don't really have me to begin with, who don't have my back. But there's definitely a lot of like school class dynamics that goes on, And I think, honestly, that's not nothing. I've definitely talked about this in the last season of this podcast of like, when I've noticed certain groups fall apart and I discover why they fell apart, and it's purely petty reasons. And I'm not saying they're not valid, but they are petty. Like when we're talking about organizing at a grassroots level to combat fascism and genocide, breaking up because one person said a thing and then I said a thing and then we just never got back to it, that's petty. And like we cannot afford to let pettiness interfere so intensely with our political activism. That said, they are valid, and there needs to be more space to address them, and more emphasis on the social aspect of this whole thing that we're doing when we're sharing space with people, when we're organizing and we find ourselves talking to the same people every day, every other day, for weeks, for months. You're gonna get on each other's nerves. You're gonna say a thing. You're gonna have an expectation from someone and they're not gonna come through. There needs to be mechanisms to be able to talk about those things. Because again, it may be petty, but again, it is still valid. We are still, none of us, when we enter into political action, we don't cease to be social animals. We don't cease to be human. We are still limited by our, psychology. And a part of it is wanting to feel involved and affirmed and validated and not ignored, So yeah, there's definitely that as well. But there's so much more to it. Again, I want to avoid any of the stuff that already exists in terms of like the Freudian libidinal, or what's the word, transference? No, it's not subjugation, but it's like, there's a word. Yeah. No, it's a word, whatever. But there's basically the Freudian concept of which the libidinal energies gets shifted into something else, to art, to fighting, to being good at chess, you know what I mean? As a way of sort of indulging that urge indirectly. I'm gonna be so annoyed. I'm gonna remember the word as soon as I'm done like filming. But for now it's just completely gone. So you'll have to Google it, or for those of you that know, you can write it in the comment section for those that don't. That's mutual aid. So yeah, sublimation. Sublimation of the drives. There you go. You see, sometimes you stick with something and it pays off. Anyway. But yeah, basically, I think these are important for community health, for the health of movement, the sustainability of movements, for us to be able to engage fully, but also sometimes so that we can get over it. You know what I mean? Like, again, when a group dies for a petty reason or a movement falls apart, and then they've just fallen apart. And there's so much potential that's just gone with that. And basically, if there was more room or space for that personal side of things, to understand that in many ways, the ways we're showing up for each other, for ourselves, for our communities, has something to do with there's like a personal aspect to it. Once there's space for that, then we can focus on the real stuff. Again, that sounds a bit weird. I'm not saying that it's unreal or not valid, but as in, again, when combating fascism, when organizing, when doing direct actions, when doing whatever, there's like a sort of real, you know what I mean? I don't know if I'm explaining myself correctly, but I mean, just to say that I do actually believe that there is a separation from the political and the personal. And oftentimes sort of just checking when those two things do intersect allows to focus on the purely political one in which we can kind of separate ourselves as human agents, just to see the thing as it is, aside from our own positionality. And I think that's good. I think that's good, healthy advice for anybody. I honestly think, and I'm very sympathetic to the fact that a lot of people are freaking out right now. And I am not. I am kind of panicking. Every time I check in on the state of fascism in Europe, I get horror. I don't get panic attacks, but I kind of do freeze. But also when I see the kind of, a term I've recently discovered, I think from Margaret Killjoy, the normalcy bias. Normalcy bias. That is exactly why what I've been talking about so much the last few months, years, which is this tendency, this incredibly strong momentum to just act as everything's normal, even though most people know it's not. But it's just, no, let's just keep going with it. Yeah, things are fucked, but let's still go on that summer holiday, That thing's fucked, but things will always tend to go back to the norm. No. It's not. It's not going to. It doesn't work that way. And you hit new normals, but that's kind of a capitulation sometimes when you accept the new normal. There's a bit of me who wanted to title the next podcast I do, "We Are All Fascists Now." This is, of course, not true. It's a bit of a sensationalist title. Maybe I'll use it, actually. Maybe I need a bit of sensationalism because, I don't know, that's how media works these days, I guess. I mean, the content's not sensationalist, but just as the title to grab people's attention. I don't like the title because there are many of us who will be victims of fascism, who are already victims of fascism. And to them, you know what I mean? I would never say we are all. The point of the phrase is to suggest that basically, for a lot of people, they don't have to be fascist in order to perpetuate fascism. And I think there are three broad groups, let's call them. The direct, the fascists, the people who are directly affected and impacted and targeted by fascists. And then there are those who are anti-fascist. So basically that a lot of the people I've been talking about the last few months and years, I guess, this kind of casual, average, white, middle-class people in Europe or whatever who are just kind of going along with things, whether they like it or not, unless they are anti-fascist, they are part of the system and kind of benefiting from it over the bodies of those deported migrants, of the trans people who are, being erased and murdered, over the 61,700 Gazawins, Palestinians, who have been massacred in Gaza. And so it's that kind of thing, if you're existing in a system of white supremacy, only being anti-racist counts. It really is not just a matter at this point, never really was, a matter just of opinion. You can have the best political analysis. You can be totally aware of everything that's going on. But how you spend your days, how you spend your money, where you put your focus on, where you put your energy and your resources, that's what really matters. And functionally, if the train is moving in this direction and you're just on that train and you're not trying to stop it, you're on the train. I don't know if that's controversial, but that's how I see it. And it's formed my understanding of Zionism, but also of imperialism, also of white supremacy. To a certain extent also of capitalism, although I think with capitalism it's in all of this, but it gets a bit fucky. Anyway, so yeah, when the political is personal, I do think it is sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't have to be. So I think that's actually, that's the episode. I hope you've enjoyed this one as always. If you enjoyed this episode and if you like this podcast, please consider supporting it. Leave a tip in the tip jar below, or become a member of our Patreon from the periphery. I'll put the link in the thing below. It's the media collective that this podcast is a part of. Becoming a member, you get a lot of cool exclusive content, especially my sub-series Keep This Between Us, where I tell funny stories. But yeah, if you can't help support financially, then leave a rating or a review wherever you're watching or listening to this podcast. Or just tell your friends and family. Help spread the word. I am definitely shadow banned to bits, so would really appreciate the help in getting this out there. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you all next time.